Welcome to Positive Disintegration, a path to authenticity. In this episode, Chris and I are talking to Katy McDaniel and Emily Strand of the Potterversity podcast, on which I'm also the technical director. So for me, this is a particularly special episode because it's bringing together two podcasts I work on, a bunch of friends who I adore, and two of my favourite subjects. We talk about the disintegration we went through on Potterversity, renaming ourselves and realigning our vision. We talk about themes in positive disintegration that we see through the book series, values, difficult emotions, and characters who experience disintegration. So, get out your wands, crack open a butterbeer, as we delve into the pages of Harry Potter and the Path of Positive Disintegration. G'day, beautiful listeners, and welcome to Positive Disintegration. I'm Emma Nicholson.
I'm Dr. Chris Wells.
Chris, I'm so excited about today's episode. I'm jumping out of my skin.
I'm excited too, although I have to say I know that you're very excited.
I know.
But I'm also excited.
Because we're talking about Potter today, one of my favourite subjects.
That's right. And I've heard, I don't know, maybe a handful of episodes of Potterversity, and I'm excited to talk with Katy and Emily today.
I know, and it's good to have friends on, so that's also made me excited because I've been lucky enough to, have some good conversations about Potter on Potterversity with these guys, and it's going to be cool to talk about it kind of through the lens of positive disintegration. So it's like my two favourite subjects are colliding.
Yeah, I just listened to the episode you did with them about food, which we'll put in the show notes, of course, but it was great. And I was listening to you, Emma, and thinking that you are such an expert about Harry Potter. I think our listeners are going to really enjoy this crossover.
Cool. Well, I'm going to welcome our guests straight on. So welcome to Emily Strand and Katy McDaniel, the hosts of the Potterversity podcast.
Hey, thanks for having us on.
Yeah, thanks for having us, Emma and Chris.
And I'm going to break tradition here and actually get you guys to read out your own bios because you're such pros at this.
Well, I won't read it out because I don't have it in front of me, but if I don't know it, then shame on me. I'm Emily Strand.
Positive disintegration, Emily.
I know.
Know yourself in a more authentic way.
I'm going to try. Okay. So I'm Emily Strand. I live in Columbus, Ohio, and I teach for a local Catholic nursing college. I teach religious studies courses and also cultural competency courses. I am, as Emma said, co-host of the podcast Potterversity with Katy, and I'm also co-host and co-creator of the podcast Meet Father Rivers with my partner in that, Eric Stiles. And I do a lot of writing and publishing in the realm of popular culture, like Harry Potter, Star Wars, and Star Trek. I have got a couple of new anthologies out that I helped co-edit with Amy H. Sturgis, and I love to explore the religious themes, especially of popular culture.
Yeah, and I'm Katy McDaniel. I'm a professor of history at Marietta College in Marietta, Ohio. And I've co-edited a couple of Harry Potter anthologies, Harry Potter for Nerds 2. And then Emily and I have an anthology coming out based on the podcast, Potterversity Essays Exploring the World of Harry Potter. And that's going to be coming out, I hope, very soon. We are committed, I think, to bringing sort of scholarly approaches to Potter studies, but also, I think, like Emily, I'm interested in all kinds of elements of popular culture. My focus tends to be on the intersections of history and popular culture. And I've written articles and done presentations on the works of Connie Willis. She writes about science fiction, where time-traveling historians go back to various crises in the past. And I wrote about Star Wars just recently with Emily's help and guidance. Thank you very much, Emily. And I'm always interested in broadening that out to look at really anything that explores the past and the role of history and the way we think about ourselves in the present.
Thanks for introducing yourselves to our listeners.
Yes, thank you. That was great. I'm very excited to have you both with us. And if you guys don't mind, I'm wondering if we could kick off this episode by talking about the fact that the podcast used to be called something else, but a controversy forced you to re-examine your name and branding and change things. And I wonder if we can talk about that.
Yeah, it's
Well,
a little
yeah.
dicey. It's a little tricky. So we were part of a podcast called Reading, Writing, Rolling, and we focused on academic discussions of really anything written by J.K. Rowling. And if you remember, like COVID summer, I have to say I was just burying myself in the Potter stuff because everything else was so hard. And it was sort of my refuge, my COVID refuge was sort of how I felt about the Potter world. And then in June, J.K. Rowling said some really, I would say, not well-informed and, kind of nasty stuff about trans people. And it sort of took away my refuge there. We really, as a team, and it was Emma, Emily, me, and our producer, Lori Beckoff, we had to think about, what do we want to do going forward? And, what do we think? Like, how does this align with what we want to do with our show? And of course, I think like a lot of people, we had felt like the author of the Potter stories was, kind of on our side in terms of inclusivity and really letting people be who they genuinely are. And this, it didn't hit us the right way. I think if we're talking about kind of ideas about personality that are based on values, our question was, how do we make sure that what we're doing is still aligned with our values, given what happened in June? And so we really talked about it a lot, I think, and had to make some changes as a result. Emily, does that sound like how you remember it? That's just my personal story.
No, it does. It does. It really does. I think I was in kind of like some denial about it. Like in my mind, I was like, well, maybe she's not going to get the invite to my fantasy dinner party, but at the same, but what is it really, is this all going to blow over in a couple weeks? But then the more that we got into it, I realized it really was, and I was especially kind of cueing off of you, Katy, and you, Emma, and our producer, Lori Beckoff, and seeing, how much upset this was causing. It's easy to kind of let something roll off when it doesn't personally affect you. And I definitely admit that I was guilty of that. And it was funny because, when the suggestion came to change our podcast name, I was really against that at first because, as somebody who has produced podcasts, I know that it's difficult to like keep your kind of brand going and keep people interested in your podcast, and changing your name is a really difficult obstacle to get past, And then it was funny because, and Katy, I hope you don't mind if I spill the beans here, but it was Katy's dad that suggested the new name of Potterversity. And the minute I heard that name, I was like, yes, let's go with that. Because I was like, that's just such a better name for our podcast.
Yeah.
Than
It's such a great name.
Yeah. My dad will enjoy the shout out a lot, Emily.
Yeah. Thank you, Dr. McDaniel.
He's very pleased with himself.
Oh, he should be pleased with himself because that is just, I love the name because it sums up in just one word what we're about. And I feel like it's easily recognizable what, when you say the name is Potterversity, they're like, oh, I know just what you do. Like, yes, we do that. Yeah.
Yeah.
So I was so pleased.
It centers the show on what we're really most interested in, which is the Harry Potter universe. And that universe, I think, is still a place where our values align in terms of those ideas of inclusion and equality and all of those things that I think we liked about it. And so we were able to kind of center the podcast there, which I think felt really good. And from the title on, I think that was helpful. Emma, is that how you remember it too?
And like Emily, I think when that first lot of tweeting came out, I was like, okay, let's just wait and see, because I'm big on second chances. And I think I was a bit deluded going, surely she's going to see the error of her ways. And I've made the mistake in the past of thinking that because I can see something and that's how my values align, that other people are going to see it the same way. But it turned out to not be the case. So I was actually quite happy with the decision that we made to move away from that. And I think, Katy, like you said, it's good to keep an inclusive space because, let's face it, the Potter fandom is massive, probably the biggest fandom at the time. And I think it was important for us to maintain that space and say there's still a place where everybody is welcome. And, in our reading of the text, we see themes of inclusivity and we see those themes about values. And it's important it was definitely important for me that we kept that space going so that we weren't abandoning the fandom. It had nothing to do with her. It had everything to do about how can we serve the fans and keep this alive for them.
Well, it's important. I mean, as somebody who was a big Potter fan myself, it was really hard to take when that happened and when she continued to say things that I would call transphobic. Yeah, I mean, it's hard. Like, why should we have to give up these characters and these stories that we love so much? And I can't remember which one of you it was who recommended Monsters, A Fan's Dilemma. But I put it, was it you, Emily?
Yes, it was. I'm obsessed with that book right now.
I put it on my wish list. I have to, as soon as I have time for, non-work reading, I'm going to read that book because this is a real problem. I mean, it is a fan's dilemma when you love something that has been created in whatever artistic, manner that is. And then you find out the person who created it is, well, problematic. I mean, and we're all human, of course, but there are levels of problematic, I would say.
I can't wait to hear what you think about that book because I really just got so much out of it. And for me, the transition to being Potterversity also had the added bonus of showing our listeners that we're focused on the text of the books. For the most part, of course, we as Katy always says very wisely, we don't focus on her. We don't let her off the hook either, but we don't put the focus solely on her or even majority on her. We really try to focus on the text. And that's part of why I liked where the transition, ended us up, because we were there now with the podcast that's really squarely focused on the text. Questions of the author and authorship and authorial intent, things like that come into play. That's a sidebar. But what we're focused on is the text. And these problematic authors really do almost give us the gift of making us focus on the works themselves. And I know, there's some schools where you do sometimes bring in the author and their background and as a point of analysis. But yeah, so I'm pleased with where we ended up. And Chris, I hope you'll send me a little message when you've read that book and tell me what you think.
I will, definitely.
I was going to say too that, just to really reemphasize what Emma and Emily have both just said, I actually felt really good about it because I felt like what we came up with was better than what we had. And so It felt like we were moving towards something better and more positive and more what we wanted to do and be. And so it wasn't like a retreat. It wasn't like we were having to muffle ourselves or anything. It felt like a really good direction to be going in. And I've really appreciated what we've been able to build under this new name, Potterversity. I'm really proud of it.
I'm so glad you brought that up, Katy, because when I thought back about it and the process that we went through, it was almost like a miniature disintegration in the fact that we had to stop. And we had to self-reflect and we had to think about, well, what are our values? What do we stand for? What are we even going to talk about that aligns with that? So we made some decisions about, we're not going to talk about cormorant strike. And we set those ground rules for ourselves. And you're right, it was more powerful going forward, but it just shows the value of taking that self-reflection step and thinking to yourself, what do I value? What is important to me? And how can I act in alignment with that so I'm walking my talk? And we did that as a little group. And I remember all those, early morning, whatever the time zone, conversations that we had.
Or late night.
6:00 on a Monday morning, like talking about what are we going to do with the podcast. But it was really fruitful and really helpful. But it just goes to show that, whether it's in a group setting or by yourself, that act of self-reflecting is really important and it can give you some really solid direction moving forward.
And I've really loved how that's, I think, strengthened our relationship as a team. I think that, we learned something about each other and we're able to talk about some things that are really difficult. And we did some good problem solving. And I just think it's been positive for our group also.
That's awesome. And I have to say that Potterversity is a fantastic name. And I really encourage our listeners to to listen to your podcast if they have an interest in Harry Potter, because it's wonderful. I really have enjoyed every episode I've listened to. And it's interesting to reflect on because, I was just getting to know Emma and I listened to her episode about Petunia Dursley with you guys. And it was like, I was like, wow, I mean, not to out myself as a total novice of podcasting when I started one, but I was like, this wasn't a format that I was really familiar with. And so, I knew that Emma was your editor. And then, she had done that episode and I listened to it and I was like, wow, how cool is it that there's like podcasts about Harry Potter and they're talking about it in this kind of scholarly way. It's really good.
Emma's bet on Petunia is really amazing. And I think one of the strengths of it is Petunia is this character that we have all these assumptions about, and we don't really necessarily even think of her as having an arc in the story. But Emma just very brilliantly brought that out through very close reading of the text. I love your interpretation of Petunia Dursley, Emma, and really brought so much to that character that I think I had not even been interested in before. And I was like, oh no, Petunia's really fascinating.
I felt the same way. I didn't know what she was going to say about Petunia that would make me like her better or, get some depth on that character. But oh my gosh, Emma, you were amazing.
Thanks.
I feel like the definitive version of that, Emma, the Petunia article is not yet written because then you got to factor in the actor's portrayal of Marva Carassi Andor in the show Andor. So you have to kind of bring that all together.
Totally agree. Totally agree.
Yeah. Yeah.
It's funny that you're talking about that episode because it was a good exercise in putting myself in someone else's shoes and seeing things from their perspective. And it's funny because in the theory, Dabrowski talks about using subject-object thinking. So rather than saying, I'm the subject, I'm the center of the universe, everyone else is object, they are all numbers and shape, of actually flipping that dynamic round and trying to use empathy to get into someone else's place. And that's really what I use to get into the nuts and bolts of Petunia. It's like, well, how would I feel if it was me in her shoes and some, wizarding war was going on and consuming my sister and Dumbledore's dropping my nephew on my doorstep like an Amazon package when I've got my own baby. And I started to actually come to her perspective a lot. And even though, I probably don't hold a lot of her opinions and stuff, I could actually see things from her perspective, which actually gave me a lot of empathy. So that was a really cool exercise. And Chris, I know you say you had no idea of what you were doing with podcasting. I had no idea what I was doing with theory. So we just combined our skills like Wonder Twin powers and went from there.
That's right. Where are our Wonder Twin rings?
You need this.
I was just going to say about being a novice to podcasting. Who's not a novice to podcast? I feel like it's this weird new thing that that a lot of people are doing now, and it's kind of everywhere. And when I started, I had no idea. And actually, one of my weak points is my oral expression, and I'm also another weak point is technology. So that it combines the two of them. I never, ever, ever would have thought I would be doing something like this, but it's really fun. It's a good excuse to have great conversations with people you've always wanted to talk with. So I really enjoy it. And you all do a nice job on your podcast too, Chris and Emma.
Yes, I've been enjoying episodes of your podcast for sure. Yeah. And Katy, I would say these used to be your weaknesses and aren't anymore. And I will also just jump in and say that I actually went to a podcasting conference in 2007.
Ooh, wow.
So I know.
Early adopter.
I was an early adopter of podcasts. So the whole thing just totally lit me up. I just thought it was so cool. And I used to go around saying to people podcasts are the future. You don't understand. We need to be doing everything with podcasts. And everybody thought I was so cuckoo crazy. And now the job that I was in at the time, I don't even have that job anymore. It's been years and years, but I just sometimes want to go back and be see podcasts.
It's storytelling. It's just a different mode of storytelling. We see the value in books and stuff. It's another way for people to share their stories.
All right, well, let's kick off questions with values and the importance of values. Where do we see themes of values in Harry Potter, and especially values that are determined for yourself or oneself?
Well, I'll jump in because I'll be honest. The first thing I think of is when Harry is in Madame Malkin's for the first time, and she's fitting him with robes, and Draco
Yes, you stole
Malfoy
mine, Emily.
Oh, I'm so sorry. I was so proud of Harry in that moment, and being an older reader, even when I first read it, I feel like I can say that. But I was very proud of him because I thought, gosh, he can smell a rat. And sorry to call you a rat, Draco, but you were in that scene. And Harry really, really just with his gut, with not a lot of good upbringing, he can tell that this kid is not the type of person for him, and he makes a choice instead of kind of desperately clinging to any offer he gets from a friendship from someone in the wizarding world. He says, "No, I think I'm good. I think I'm good." And so, and I like that because he, maybe he wouldn't have gotten any other offers of friendship, but he knew he didn't want that one. And I really admire that in Harry.
To me, that's where you see that Harry does have some internal core that has not actually been damaged by his experience with the Dursleys. I don't know if it's reinforced because he's always around, Dudley, but also the Dursleys themselves are social climbers. And, maybe he just can recognize that because he's on the outside of that and he's been oppressed by it. I'm not sure, but he's at least able to, he has some sense of himself and that, he doesn't need that. He's not trying to win friends and influence people in that way. And I think it speaks to something that is, I don't know. I mean, you wonder, did he get that in his first year of life? That seems very unlikely. He was living, with his parents. But there is something in him that he has, and you can see that right away. And, it's not just in his politeness, even to Hagrid or what have you, but also in his willingness to, like you say, call a rat, somewhat politely.
It's funny because Harry, he seems to have that, what Dabrowski would call positive maladjustment. So he sees what's going on around him and he goes, you know what? No, that's not for me. And he defines himself. And Dumbledore actually calls that out, I think in the Half-Blood Prince, when he's talking to the Dursleys and says, he might not have been as well looked after as Dumbledore would have liked, but he was whole, and then comments about he avoided the terrible damage that got inflicted on Dudley. And maybe that's what Dumbledore's alluding to. Like, Harry doesn't get it because, let's face it, there's a lot of shit Harry doesn't get. But I think Dumbledore's talking to that. Harry came out well-grounded with his own values that are defined in a way that makes him empathetic to other people and accepting and inclusive, whereas Dudley turned out to be a little snot. But the thing that I find interesting is when he gets to the Chamber of Secrets and he questions all that, because he's like, I'm so much like Riddle. Am I the heir of Slytherin? And even though he knows he's not setting the basilisks on people, he starts questioning who he is because of this. And then Dumbledore comes in and says, no, it's not about your attributes. It's about your choices and how you act, and reminds him that Harry chooses to act in a particular way that lines up with those values.
Yeah, he chooses not to go into Slytherin. Oh, sorry.
Yeah, no, that's what I mean, too. Yeah.
Not Slytherin, not Slytherin.
That's right. I mean, not Slytherin. That's a very clear choice.
Yeah. Based on what he's heard from Hagrid, who also, Hagrid is it's not glamour that Hagrid represents. And Harry's able to see the value of Hagrid and Hagrid's opinion. And then, it's clear to him, like, the other houses would be okay. He's not like aiming for Gryffindor particularly, but he knows that he doesn't want to go into the house that had all the bad wizards produced from that. And then that's what Emma is, so interesting about book 2. He's questioning some of that. And I think it has to do with, I was reading a little bit on positive disintegration, and a lot of the beginning stage is, you absorbing what the society says is you, is supposed to be who you are and what you should be doing and so on. And there's some way when he, is caught speaking parcel tongue that somehow everybody else uses this to tell Harry what he's supposed to be and who he's supposed to be. And it challenges his own self-perception in a way that really causes him distress, but leaves him, in a stronger, more secure position at the end. It just seemed like it matched really well with the positive disintegration theory.
Yeah, you're right. He questions it to the point where he goes to the Sorting Hat and says, did you make the right choice putting me in Gryffindor? Should you have put me in Slytherin? Like, he's at that point of doubt where he doesn't even know in himself whether or not anymore he should be in Gryffindor or not.
And, the reminder that he has agency, right? That he has self-actualization, I think is such an important, one of those moments where Dumbledore talks to him at the end. And one of the most important ones, a common friend of ours, Lana Whited, has that on the signature of her email. It's such an important, it's our choices that are important.
Lana's totally my Dumbledore. She really is.
That's right. Very wise.
That's part of why.
While we're on the subject of houses and values, I wanted to get some thoughts on Hufflepuff, because the other three houses arguably are trait-based. So, the Sorting Hat sings a song, and, Ravenclaw's where all the smart people go, and Gryffindor's where all the brave people go, and Slytherin's where all the ambitious people go. But Hufflepuff is often seen as the leftover, the dregs house. But really, when you dig into it, it's about loyalty and fairness and hard work. And it's really, to me, like a values-based house. And I kind of wondered whether or not that's why Cedric got chosen as the champion.
I will say right now that my entire opinion of Hufflepuff is based on the musical Puffs. Yeah, it's like one of my favorite works of, probably my absolute favorite work of Harry Potter fan art. And yeah, I mean, I would say they're all values-based houses, but Hufflepuff, I feel like they really have the values that we all prize, rather than just the flashy braves, and the slithery snakes and the obvious value on smarts and intelligence. But Hufflepuff is really where, the magic happens. The hard work, the loyalty, just the earthiness. There's an earthiness to Hufflepuffs that gets stuff done, and gets it done well and with heart. And I just really, and I think that musical really it really shows what's essential to Hufflepuff, and shows us how that's something that all of us value, really.
Well, and I think one of the challenges, though, Emily, is that they are regarded as, what does Hagrid say, a load of duffers or something like that,
How eloquent.
There's, and that tends to happen when you have, fraternities or school clubs. Like, there's one where you get the kids who are not the cool kids, and they're, more a little offbeat or something. And what I find really interesting is that their cachet or whatever is like nil. They're not cool, but they have these values. And I think that's an interesting, that some people wouldn't want to be in Hufflepuff. I don't know that their values are appreciated as much as some of the other ones. But ultimately, I think the story suggests that the Hufflepuff values are really, really extremely important. And you see that with Cedric. He's such a good embodiment of those values. And even though he could really dislike Harry and be vindictive or whatever, he's actually ends up being pretty kind to him and apologizes when other people don't treat him well, and he rises above in a way. And it's one of the things I don't like about the cursed child. And we can talk about that if you want, but the cursed child, like imagining that if something, that somehow Cedric would become vengeful toward Harry for being humiliated, like that just doesn't ring true to Cedric's character at all.
No,
right, especially from a values standpoint,
Right.
There's one little line, and I'm big for going into tiny snippets of dialogue and making huge big meaning out of it. But there's one little line where Harry tells Cedric about the dragons coming up. And the thing that Cedric does is he doesn't just go, oh, cool, I know, my advantage. He says to Harry, why did you tell me this? He wants to know what Harry's motivation is. And when Harry says it's only fair that we all know, that I think that really speaks to Cedric and his values, and he accepts that as a reason for being told. And so he takes it on board, and then he pays the favour back by telling Harry to take the egg into the bathroom. But I think that was a really good clue to Cedric's personality. He's like, why are you telling me? What are you getting out of this? And when Harry makes that declaration that he's doing it out of fairness, I think that's when Cedric kind of accepts it.
Yeah, and can I just, this is taking it in a different direction, but not totally different, but the people who are fans of the Harry Potter story, like, who hasn't been sorted into your house? That's something that everybody wants to do. And I think it's really interesting to think about how the house sorting plays out among fans. And when I first did old school Pottermore, like way back, I was sorted into Slytherin, and I was like, no! Right, that's
Slytherin,
no
not
good.
Slytherin.
I know. And it was like, oh no, like, how do I adjust my worldview if I'm looking at it through the eyes of Slytherin? And then there was all kinds of like, all the people who were in Slytherin were like, don't panic, we're actually pretty nice. And it was a way to try to soothe the various people who'd gotten sorted into Slytherin because it was unpopular. But then on the new Pottermore, you had to start over. And as I was redoing the quiz, which I know is probably just random anyway, I tried to answer all the questions. I was like, what would be the least Slytherin answer to this question? Like, let's make my choices, make a difference here. And in fact, I was sorted into Hufflepuff the next time. And I was like, I think that is like the anti-Slytherin. I think Hufflepuff is the antithesis to Slytherin, not Gryffindor. And so in that way, I was like, yeah, I'll be a Hufflepuff.
This is so funny to me. Like, when I did the original, I don't think I've done the newer Pottermore, but when I did the original one, I got sorted into Hufflepuff, and I was like, hell no, this can't be right. I mean, because I always fancied myself, Gryffindor. But it's funny because it really made me look at that and say, oh my gosh, I mean, maybe I do have those Hufflepuff values. And I realized, I mean, from my perspective, I was like, I feel like it's like a social work house. And because, my master's degree is in social work, and that's around that time of my life that first Pottermore came out. But yeah, I didn't want to be a Hufflepuff. I didn't really see myself in that house. But it's interesting because once that happened, it forced me to see Hufflepuff like through new eyes and recognize that I did have maybe these aspects of myself that I hadn't thought of. But also that I was always kind of an outsider when I was growing up. I didn't fit into any of like the typical cliques of like high school, for instance. And, and so I could be friends with people from other groups, but I never felt like I fit into any of them.
Yeah, that's really interesting. And I think, what was interesting too is that I think the people who are Hufflepuff Harry Potter fans also are like really big into let's pump up our Hufflepuff identity. And the play Puffs, which Emily was talking about, it really hits this idea that you have this house that's kind of ignored and, that's not as respected as the other ones. And yet they're really, I think they do have really great values. And of course, Newt Scamander has brought a little Hufflepuff pride as well.
Yes. Yes. Love it. Love it. I think I just have a real positive attitude toward, and I'm not a Hufflepuff. I'm actually a Gryffindor. Like every test I take is like, before I can even click like my answers, they're like, Gryffindor. Like this one.
You're like
Gryffindor.
the Ron Weasley. It barely, the sorting hat barely touches your head.
It touches my head. But, when I was in like, I think it was third grade, there was this new girl. And she just decided that the best way to gain friends and influence is to sort of unseat me from the little social group. So I don't know why I was picked. I was just picked. And so she kind of like ousted me. And all the girls that I used to hang out with, they all kind of turned their back on me, like at her, under her influence, which was kind of a really interesting situation. Not nice at the time, but I remember consciously thinking to myself, all right, there are like 2 or 3 kids in this class I don't know. They were kind of like the ones that other people thought were the duffers, not popular, didn't care about clothes, didn't care about social status, kind of did their own thing. And I thought to myself, I'm going to get to know these kids because I don't have any other options and I want to have some friends. I'm a people person, right? And I got to know those kids and they were the coolest kids and I'm still friends with them.
Aww.
And I think that's why I'm always like even though I'm not a Hufflepuff, I'm a Hufflepuff fan because these are the kids. And it was funny because they introduced me. Two of them were, one of them was a twin and her twin was in the other class. And she was really good friends with this woman who ended up being my absolute best friend of all time and like musical partner. Just such a great move, to get to know these people. So I think that's why I'm always so, I think people think they know what they want in friends and colleagues and things like that, but what they actually want is Hufflepuffs.
But
they were being honest.
Isn't this, and Emma and Chris, you can help me. Isn't this positive disintegration what you just described? That you were in a situation big. Where you felt like you knew who you were and you knew who your friends were, and then you had this unsettling, disintegrating experience, and you had to rethink that, and it ended up being positive. That's cool.
Yeah.
It was definitely a recreation. I'm wrong. I'm new to positive disintegration, so.
No, that does seem like you had an experience like that. And I think like really you identify positive disintegration through the dynamisms that emerge in your life based on a situation like that. So if you go through something and you find yourself, struggling with different dynamisms for different levels of development, right? And so,
shame.
Guilt, shame, which way sure, but also, when when you're younger, you may be more likely to have like ambivalence or, be caught up in what he called the second factor, which is like when you're worried about what other people think of you. Or so really what we're hearing from you, Emily, on that was that you were like breaking out of the second factor and saying, okay, well, I'm not going to buy into, like these social scripts and I'm going to talk with these kids who aren't popular and get to know them. And yeah, it's an interesting thing.
Yeah, it definitely like took popularity, evacuated it of any kind of authority in my life. I was like, okay, so if this happens, it's great. And if it doesn't, it's probably totally random. Because I could see, even as a third grader, I could see how random it was that this girl just picked me to oust, from the group and take my place. So I could see the kind of arbitrariness of it. And that really was very formative for me moving forward.
I'm mad at those other friends though, Emily. I'm mad at those other
too.
I think they were mad at themselves after a few weeks because I went and made myself perfectly happy with these other kids.
And I'm sure you're fun. Like this collection of desks you're at is the fun desks in the third grade.
These kids I got to know were more fun, more interesting, more creative, more intelligent than any of those other kids. And that's what that taught me about popularity, is that that's not where you're going to find the most interesting people.
But that's so Harry. That's so Gryffindor, because when Harry goes to Hogwarts, who does he pick as his friends? Not Draco, not the popular kids. He goes straight for Ron,
Muggleborn,
who's outcast for being poor, and he goes for Hermione, who everybody else thinks is annoying, but he starts to appreciate the fact that she's got all this knowledge. So he makes friends with everyone, and Neville.
Neville, yeah. And Luna, I was thinking about Luna when we were talking about this. And he goes to the party with Luna as his date.
Love that.
And he's like, Luna's cool. Luna, will you be my date? She's like, cool. So, and she's so interesting, and she's really definitely super not cool. And then for her to be brought into that friendship group, and that scene where they go to her father's house and they see that she has their pictures on the room and friends. I mean, I can hardly even say it without choking up. It's so beautiful about the power of friendship.
She's not only not cool, she's also super authentic. She says exactly what she's thinking.
Amen.
She believes what she believes and doesn't care if everybody else is picking on her for what she believes. And she's always exactly Luna and never tries to be anyone else, even if it gets her a complete ribbing.
True. Well, let's move to the next question of like questioning one's values, because that's exactly what we're talking about here. And you already brought up positive maladjustment, which Order of the Phoenix and Umbridge and creating this Dumbledore's army together, like to fight back. I mean, to me, like there's so many spots. Do you think that's right, Emma? I have to admit that I have such a rusty knowledge of Potter right now because I haven't gone back and read the books in several years.
I think you're right. I think that's a moment where they innately know that just because this is coming from a place of authority doesn't make it right. And they rebel even though it could get them into a hell of a lot of trouble, and eventually it does. But that's just pushing against that status quo. And you don't see any of the Slytherin kids sort of pushing back against it or questioning it. They're all on board. They want to all join that inquisitorial squad. They're going to toe the line, but not Harry and his friends, because they understand that there's more important things to be doing. And I think even though some of the kids that join Dumbledore's army, maybe they're there for curiosity, or maybe they're there because they want to hear about Harry's story, but ultimately they're there because they know this is the right thing to do. They need to prepare. And what they're preparing for is to ultimately to fight against Voldemort, which is a really scary prospect. But they're taking that on board anyway.
Yeah, and one of the things I think is really interesting in book 5, I was going to try to bring this up because I think it fits so well with the idea of positive disintegration, as I've sort of read a little bit about it in preparation. So at the beginning of book 5, when the members of the Order come to collect Harry, do you remember they give him the disillusionment charm? And it feels like
he's getting egg cracked over his head.
Yeah, the cold feeling around it. And I thought, how it's so interesting, disillusionment charm. And of course, it's serving a particular purpose there. But I was like, that's telling you something is going to be happening to Harry and the way that he thinks about the world and various people. And I think book 5 is very much about, the process of him trying to figure out who he is, right? Suddenly he's a criminal. He's, definitely at odds with Umbridge. I like how Hermione is able to hear Umbridge's beginning of the term speech. And everybody's like, blah, blah, blah. And Hermione's like, no, we got to look out for this one. Because
subtext, guys, subtext.
That's right. She's like, there was a lot going on. And right. So seeing this authority figure, and for Hermione too, like she has to come to understand that not all authorities are to be obeyed or even respected. And that's such an important part of maturity. I was thinking about in general, so important to think about this concept of positive disintegration with these teenagers, which is what we're following from 11 to 17 through the series. That's the time when you have a lot of those, struggles and questioning of like, what would I be if I didn't have all these things around me, telling me what I was supposed to be, or my parents telling me what I'm supposed to be. And I think Harry is figuring out so much in that book 5 as he's disillusioned with some of the wonders of the magical world.
Thankfully, though, he's got Sirius, who is an absolute role model for rebelling against everything and doing your own thing. And the book that we've got coming out, my essay's on Sirius. So, I've done a lot of digging into this, but he had a family that were pro-Voldemort, basically, pro getting rid of the Muggleborns and having the wizards and the purebloods rule. And he just rebelled against that his entire life. He rebelled against the cool thing at school to a certain extent, because he didn't really he was cool, and obviously he probably enjoyed some of the attention, but to a lot of things, like Sirius just marched to the beat of his own drum. And, he had to go through that thing of disowning his own family and being accused of being things he was not, and putting up with that stint in Azkaban. So I think Harry was quite lucky to have this father figure role model in his life that sort of said, it had to sit him down at one point when he was having those dreams about Mr. Weasley and thinking that he's turning into a monster. And Sirius is like, no, that we've all got light and dark in us, and it's the part that you're acting on that's important. And trust me, I've been through this.
Right. And I love the thing that he says, too, about how the world's not just made up of good people and Death Eaters, so that he's adding some complexity to it. And you're absolutely right. Like, he's such a great model of the rebellious spirit. And of course, there are ways that you can think, well, Sirius kind of takes that pretty far, but it's great for Harry to be able to see that and to see that, you can strike out. And I definitely think like Sirius really had to do that in a very harrowing way with distancing himself from his family. Yeah.
You guys are just being brilliant, and I just can't agree more. And I will also say, Emma, I've always loved Sirius, but your chapter really made me appreciate him and his nonconformity in a new way. So it's definitely recommended reading.
Where are we seeing instances of dynamisms? Meaning, where are we identifying like uncomfortable emotions in characters? Where are other points of disintegration? And I'm trying to think of like other people than like Harry, Hermione and Ron even.
There's so much of that. And I think Emma actually suggested this, and I was like, yes. Dobby is just a great example. And in fact, his emotions and his drives are so hard for him to accept that he even punishes himself for having them. He's not allowed to speak out against the family, the Malfoys. And so he's constantly punishing himself for having them. And yet he does persist. And he is, to me, this is my reason for being with this book is Dobby's journey towards self-actualization and his movement from being an enslaved, unfree being who nevertheless knew what was right and wrong. He knew that Harry was somebody who, was fighting for the dregs of the magical world. And he did the right thing, even when it flew in the face of tradition. And even when he felt he had to punish himself for what he was doing because of all of those internalized boundaries that he was crossing. And he gets free. And then it's really hard. It's hard for him to be free. Like he's wandering around. We don't see him wandering around, like trying to get a job. And like, it's hard out there for a free house elf. And so he even when he's free, he doesn't have it easy. It's not like happily ever after for him. And so then we see him in these other ways developing over the course of the story until, Dobby has no master. Dobby is a free elf, and he is then able to do this amazing act of heroism at the end that to me just speaks so much to the power of freedom and really being who you are so that you can see what's right and fight for what's right and for your friends.
Well, you just gave me goosebumps. I feel like that was a perfect example.
I just love Dobby so much.
Yeah. Same, Katy. Second all that about Dobby. But who I started thinking of is really two people. So one is Mrs. Weasley. And I think I'm identifying with her at this stage in my child's life. I only have one child, not 7. But he's going through some kind of like, I'm having to learn to like let him go and let him do his own thing and not, keep telling him over and over, just wait and see if he does it himself. And also, he's starting to spend the night away from the household, and it's kind of new and different. And I think the pandemic has made it even more challenging because it all got pushed back a few years, this stuff. But I'm thinking of Mrs. Weasley in the way that she has to watch even her youngest children become soldiers almost, become people who are in the fight. And she wants to protect them, she wants to protect them, keep them home and keep them safe, but she can't do that. And she has to learn that, especially over the course of, 5 through 7, books 5 through 7. And that's really hard for her. And I really identify with her as a parent. The other person I thought about was also Lupin, and how, over the course of book 7, he has to finally figure out that he's worthy of love and of family and of, being a parent and being a husband, and that he can't just run away from these things, even if they're scary and he fears, his own inability to do it well. And he has to figure these things out. And he does. And unfortunately he kind of pays the ultimate price in the end for sticking in the fight and sticking around. But those are, I feel like those are a couple characters that really have to go through reckonings.
I was going to say Lupin's the guilt and shame poster boy. He feels guilty just about who he is. Not even he doesn't have to do anything wrong. He just feels shame, so much shame over who he is.
Self-loathing.
Yes, so much self-loathing.
And, I think a lot of people are really disappointed with him when he leaves without a fight at the end of book 3. He's just like, nobody's going to want a werewolf for their kid's teacher, so I'm going to head out now. And, for the fan reaction to that is like, why didn't he stay and fight? And I mean, I think that's easy to say when you're not in that category of people, and he feels that shame because he's definitely been made to feel that way over the course of his life. But then he does really come into himself. I think that's a great example, Emily. But then, it's not easy for him. It's not easy for him to accept Tonks, and Tonks's love. And then the idea that, he actually has an important role to play in his son's life. It's hard for him. And then when he goes out, like he's going out on his terms and doing what's right and what needs to be done. And to me, that's exceptionally powerful. I also wanted to say also about your Mrs. Weasley. I was like, yes, we want to protect them, as their soldiers against, murderous evil. But also, like, how hard was it for her to accept Fleur as Bill's wife? So that was the first. I was like, oh, she's going to talk about Fleur, and then we were talking about, oh no, she wants to protect them from death. Yes, but also from the Vila.
Yeah.
Right. Yeah. Until Fleur showed a little bit of real substance, you know, and the ability to love Bill, even when his looks were going to be gone. I think, that was her concern. It's like, are these two going to stick together when they're not so pretty anymore? And as soon as Fleur showed any indication that she wasn't there for that, Mrs. Weasley's like, well, okay.
Well, a bit more than that. I think it's because Fleur just told her to fuck off. It basically put her in her place in a very visceral way and said, you know what, you're thinking about this wrong. Shut up. And to Molly's credit,
give me that bowl.
Took it on board, went, oh, maybe I am thinking about things the wrong way, and was able to sort of reflect on how she'd been acting and went, you know what, I've been a real dick. And they were able to move on.
I had assumptions about Fleur that were based on prejudice, I think,
I've got 2 examples. One's probably, I guess, more straightforward, and the other one's a bit of a fan theory of mine. So where I see dynamisms most boldly is actually with Dumbledore. So when Dumbledore was young, he was in love with Gellert Grindelwald, and he was all about that for the greater good shit. He had this stuff from his youth that had obviously sort of tainted his views toward muggles, but he was fully prepared to walk out into the world and seize power with Gellert. But then all that shit happened with Ariana, and he was forced to really self-reflect and say, what do I believe? And he transformed from someone who was, young and arrogant and all about seizing power to someone who was inclusive and acceptive and all about protecting the muggles. And he went through a ton of guilt and a ton of shame and a ton of dissatisfaction in himself, and no doubt had to sit back and say, who the fuck am I? What are my values? What am I fighting for? Like, that would have been a monumental moment of disintegration for him, no doubt. We don't see it directly in the books, but if you look at where he started and where he ended up, and the fact that he's with Harry and King's Crustacean at the end, like, just saying, I really stuffed that up. Like, he still felt guilt even after he'd passed away about that. So that's one place where I really sort of see that playing out. And the surprise one for me is actually Dudley. Harry thinks to himself, when Dudley gets attacked by the Dementors, what could Dudley possibly feel bad about? That because the Dementors make you relive your worst memories, right? But I've got a theory on that. My theory is that the Dementors made Dudley look at all those moments of his life where he'd bullied Harry and he'd bullied other kids. And I think they made him feel a bunch of repressed shame and guilt that he was in denial about. So, Vernon and Petunia were like all about they just babied him and coddled him. And I think maybe that's what I alluded to before when I said Dumbledore spoke about the damage inflicted on Dudley. They put him in a state of denial about who he really was inside. And you'll notice that from the Dementor attack point, he was different to Harry. Like, he left Harry alone. He left him the cold cup of tea. He had a change of heart at the end and shook Harry's hand and said he didn't think he was a waste of space. And that's what I think Dudley actually went through his own moment of, oh, crap, who am I? Who have I been? And I think he felt a whole heap of those dynamisms and a whole heap of that self-doubt. And that's what I think he saw when the Dementors attacked him.
I love that. And one of the things that's been my great dissatisfaction with the last novel was that I didn't think we got that with Draco. I felt like with Dudley, we could see there's some growth and change there, and Dudley, like, there's something kind of interesting going on with him. And with Draco, I didn't see that as much. I do think, Draco, I was thinking about this in terms of positive disintegration, and I'm not sure exactly where it fits, but I think the whole Malfoy family is having, some tension over, we're purebloods and we want political power and domination over wizarding society and certainly over Muggles. But then when they see what it's like, and they see that it's actually, it's really taking over their family and it's taking over their relationships and it's putting them in jeopardy. And I think that Lucius and Narcissa are actually very bothered by how Draco is put in danger, like not dissimilar to, Emily, what you were talking about with Mrs. Weasley. And ultimately, where do they end up? They're loyal to each other as a family. And you can see some of that. I'm not sure that's not as high an ideal of, as maybe I had wanted. And it's definitely not, I never think of Draco as having a moment of redemption, but at least it does show that they are valuing their family over this ideology and the ambition that they had placed in it. And so there's something there that makes me think that they as a family would maybe be changed at the end of it.
I think there's something to that. I think that they move out of, that very like integrated state that they're in of, like all what you just described. And they go into you see that there's a possibility, like the possibility exists that they could rethink and disintegrate. But I also agree that they don't get there. And it's too bad because I don't know. It's interesting to me. Like I can tell that in my mind, some fan fiction has like bled into my memories of reading the books because I think that like so many people, when I hit the end of the books and I'd read them more than once, I like dove into fan fiction. And it's really interesting when you get into fan fiction because you see like what upsets other people about the story and they try to make it right in their own writing and they take the relationships that they think are important and write about them. And there's so much in the fan fiction world about Draco redemption stories, Draco and Harry as a couple or like whatever, it's just fascinating to me. There's so much that you can do with these characters and like put them through their trials that you come up with if you want to, but that's obviously a whole different path.
Yeah, no, I do love that though. Because what that does is it shows you that the fans are looking for some growth from these characters. And, if, the author's not going to give it to me, well, I'll just make that one myself, or what people call head canon, which I love. It's just in my head. This is absolutely the way the story went and should have gone all along. And I agree with that. And something that I think is interesting about those, the romantic pairings, whether it's Harry Draco or Hermione Draco or whatever, I think they're interesting partly because, and I'm saying romance, but we know it's often quite physical, that there is some kind of, I don't know, like some kind of apology, some kind of, reconciliation that's supposed to be representing. And I just find that to be really interesting, thought experiment through narrative.
Agreed. Well, in headcanon, I've never heard of that. So yes, thank you. That's very I can tell that I have my own headcanon for sure.
Yeah, definitely. Like me and the musical Puffs. So it's just basically my headcanon. It's like,
I need to
yeah.
check that out because I haven't heard of it.
You will
So
love
good.
it. You will love it. It's fun, but it has so much heart, and it truly is right in line with the values of the series
Yeah.
itself. I just love it. I also wanted
Genuinely
to say,
great story.
yeah. Emma, I wanted to respond to what you said about Dumbledore's transformation too. And one of the things I think is interesting is that, he's still flawed for sure, right? And one of the things that is problematic is that he kind of leaves Harry to discover his flaws after Dumbledore is gone. And this sends Harry into another phase of disintegration, I think, right? Where he's got to decide, like, wait, if Dumbledore wasn't a good guy, then what am I doing? And then he has to really come to own his own values and not just say, I'm Dumbledore's man, right? So that he has to come to it for himself.
And he does that at Dobby's grave, ironically, when he's Horcruxes Hallows. Do I trust the Dumbledore? Do I follow that path? And by the time he meets up with Aberforth in Hogsmeade, he's made his mind up, but he had to take, you're right, he had to take that time of self-reflection to say, what do I believe? What do I trust? How do I want to act?
Right. Yeah. And not to assume naively that the side of good is represented by perfect people. I think Aberforth even pushes him on it. He's like, why are you following my brother? And so that Harry really has to own it. He has to make very conscious decisions along the way once he decides. And to me, that's an extra phase of maturity that he has to, again, to really understand that he's imperfect, and so are some of his heroes.
I'm going to ring composition this and circle it all the way back to the beginning. The power in the headcanons, the reason why people in fanfics want resolution, the reason why people are still looking at these books and they're seeing their own journeys reflected here is because it shows that people are going through their own stuff like this. And even if they don't have the labels from the theory to put on it, maybe they are going through their own disintegrations. Maybe they are feeling dynamism. Like Emily told us she was feeling this way, in third grade. It happens to kids, it happens to teenagers, it happens to adults. And we're all going through that continual process of trying to figure out who the fuck we are. What do we value? What's important? How should I be behaving? And I think that just shows the importance of us trying to get the theory out there, because once people have these frameworks, and whether it be in something like fiction or whether it be from the theory, it helps us make sense of those journeys. And I think that's really why I gravitated to the Potter series in the first place without even understanding what the hell it was about, because when I was deep in these books and rereading them all the time, I was going through a really shit period of disintegration. I couldn't figure my life out. I didn't know who I was. And now looking back on it, I see that the reason why they spoke so powerfully to me is because it was describing something that I was going through myself.
That's really powerful. Right. I agree with that too. And I think literature can serve that purpose, but also really good to be conscious of these processes. And we're in a society that sort of suggests that we should be happy all the time, and if you're not happy, like, what's wrong with you? We need to give you some, take some drugs or like get some therapy or something, but that actually powerful and difficult emotions are important. And I think the books show that as well.
Right. And then they also give us this story that has a lot of promise in the end. And it's not the promise of no more troubles or everybody lives happily ever after. It's an alchemical story. So it does end in pure gold and the transformation into pure gold. But there is that loss along the way. But it helps us understand that loss as a contributor to our ability to, reach that golden state in the end.
Emily and Katy, I'm so glad that you joined us. And all I can think of is I hope that you'll come back, because for one thing, I would love to talk with you all about Snape And like, there's just other
Ooh.
characters. We just have to
Yes.
come back, I think, and do like another whole
Can of
episode.
worms alert. Can of worms alert.
Yeah, this was fun though. I'd love to come back.
It was.
Thank you.
It was.
Thanks so much for coming on here. It's been fantastic, and it's good to host you guys on our podcast. And I love working with you guys on Potterversity, and it's been fantastic to have you here. So thank you so much.
Same.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you both.
Thank you, Chris. Always a pleasure.
Thank you. It is always a pleasure.
And thank you, listeners. We really appreciate you joining us on this journey, and we hope that you got as much out of it as we did. Continue your path to authenticity through the links in the show notes. Subscribe to our Substack newsletter for stacks of cool things delivered straight to your inbox. Explore the Dabrowski Centre, email us, or join us on social media. And don't forget to show your love by liking, subscribing, grabbing some Positive Disintegration merch, or leaving us a rating or review on your podcast platform.